Hello and welcome to my woolly PhD. I'm Liz Scarf and this is a weekly vlog about what I'm currently learning in my anthropology PhD all about wool. So if you want to follow along, click on the subscribe button and turn your notifications on. I'm doing this every week, pretty much at the end of the week. And you can find a brief overview of the whole research project, or at least how I'm thinking about it at the start, in the introductory video. But otherwise, let's get stuck into this week. What's been going on this week? I am learning a little bit about haptic perception this week. Now, if you have never heard the word haptic before, don't stress, because until about 2 years ago, I had never heard the word either. And I've got a reasonable vocabulary. Anyway, and then it took me ages to remember it. I was like, what's that thing? It begins with a H. It's about touch. Haptics is about touch. Very basically. It's super complex, so it's really, really cool. Anyway, I've been trying to get more of a grasp on that, pun intended, grasp, over the past few months. But particularly this week, I've been reading a lot about that. Because a big part of what I think I'm going to need to do for this research is learn to be a more sophisticated toucher-feeler, right? So I'm doing that in a couple of ways at the moment, which I'll share in the video. So one is about learning about haptic research, and then is about putting it into action, being much more intentional and thoughtful and exploratory and sort of experimental about how I touch things, or wool, basically. So let's start with what I've been reading, and I'll put the list in the notes. So this is maybe the boring bit of the video, so feel free to be distracted. I just think it's really important to acknowledge who I'm learning from, and I had some of them printed out, but anyway, I don't print out everything. I print out things I think are more important, that I really want to read more in depth, because I just learn better reading paper than screens, but I also want to mix it up so my eyes don't burn out before the end of the PhD. So anyway, I've been reading Tactile Analytics by Alvarez, Astacio, Haptics by Myers and Dumit, Haptic Geographies, Ethnography, Haptic Knowledges and Sensuous Dispositions by Paterson, A Sensory Approach for Multispecies, Anthropology by Fijn and Kavesh, The Haptic Experience of Culture by Bronner, Haptic Perception, a Tutorial by Lederman and Klatzky, Object-Based Learning in the Social Sciences, 3 Approaches to Haptic Knowledge Making by McGowan, Hoffstaedter and Creese. I have also, from last week, still reading that book, Sheep by Philip Armstrong, and it's still just such a great book. And the connection between sheep and capitalism, super interesting. I'm going to have to do that in another video. So I'll come back around to that one when I spend more time focusing on it. But for this week, it's about haptics. So as a research area, it could be kind of crudely described as being about touch, but haptic perception as like a form of sensory perception, right? Like seeing or hearing or smelling. It isn't just about cutaneous or like skin contact, but it's about a whole haptic system that includes kinesthesia, which is like knowing where your body is in space, how it's positioned. It also includes movement and balance, so vestibular systems as well. So haptic perception is really quite complex, and I would tend to think it engages a lot of the body. So, and then this idea of haptic knowledge is, what does the body, or what do we know through haptic perception? What can we know? How can we generate, and how do we generate knowledge through haptic perception? And it's not a form of knowledge generation that is commonly engaged in academic research. I think for a few reasons. One that people put forward is about that maybe sort of since the Enlightenment period in Western culture, there's really been a hierarchy of senses. So this idea that real knowledge comes from auditory and visual senses, but base pleasures, that's what touch, smell and taste is for, right? So not for real knowledge generation. Now this is actually full of colonial and racialized and gendered intersections, which again will be a topic for another video. But haptic anthropology is quite a small field, but I think it's hugely exciting because it offers like an unexplored, well, not fully unexplored, but mostly unexplored standpoint at which to kind of perceive cultural happenings and world making, and generate knowledge about that. So I think it's really exciting. But also because wool I think is first and foremost so much about touch and movement, right? Texture, elasticity, we loop it around itself to create fabrics. We put twist energy into it to turn it into a stronger yarn to make things with. It's all about touch and movement. So I think to explore it through touch and movement, or really with a mind to that, it's, it just makes sense. But there's lots of challenges, aside from the fact that there's not a lot of methodologies to draw on here. But I think one of the big challenges about working with touch is about awareness, because doing something with your body and then trying to be aware of what's happening at the same time, I think is quite complicated, because touch is also something that draws your attention inside and outside of yourself. If we think about there being an inside and outside of ourselves, there is and there isn't, right? And I think it's complicated. So passive touch, so touch that kind of happens to you, usually pulls our attention inward to the inner experience of the touch. But active touch, where we're doing the touching, usually our attention goes to the thing that we're touching as we're trying to determine or know something about it through touch. And so this kind of shifting awareness states, and how could you do both at once? And then have the wherewithal to kind of make any documentation about that. I think it's exciting but complicated. And in this video, I'm going to focus a bit more on some explorations of active touch as a form of getting to know or understand something about what I'm touching, about the wool, right? Because haptics, like haptic perception, tells us about characteristics about something, about the what, but it can also tell us about the where, so where something is located and how it's located relative to other things. And then there's a whole other direction in haptics around how haptic perception is about context and social and emotional associations with touch. And I'll do another video on that one because that's super interesting as well. But for now, let's play with wool. So, and also thinking about how does different forms that wool takes direct us in how we want to touch it, how we will touch it, how we won't touch it. I think that's really, really interesting. Like, it's not just me directing touch, I'm also being directed by the form that the wool takes too. So I'll show you a little bit about what I mean in a moment. So one thing I will say though about wool and touch, it's about roughness and softness, right? So roughness has actually been the main focus of most haptic research outside anthropology. And for many of us, our acculturated or like our learned touch perception, it's quite basic and it's mostly centered on roughness. Is it soft or is it rough? And this is, I think it's huge with wool, right? We'll often be testing for how soft is it, therefore what can I make with it? Because I won't wear it if it's too rough. Right? Not everyone. Certainly from what I hear in Iceland, there's like a certain pride to be taken in being able to wear scratchy wool close to the skin. I imagine that's the case in a few places. I don't think it's much the case in Australia. I certainly haven't come across it. Maybe it is in some areas. Anyway, but it's I think significantly responsible for the global domination of merino, right? It's the softest sheep fibre, which has put many other sheep breeds at risk. And also led to huge amounts of wasted wool from breeds that aren't as soft. I think particularly in Northern Europe, it's a big issue. Anyway, onto some wool. I've got a few different forms to go through and also explain some of the different kinds of touch I've been learning about. So if you've got wool with you, great, play along. If you don't, you can hit pause and go grab something, or just play around with what's around you, because there'll be different objects or things that you'll be able to sort of play around with touch, right? So this first thing I've got is this very gorgeous skein of Black Wattle Mallee 4-ply. It's a sock yarn and Sequoia is the colourway. Black Mallee is a dyer in ACT and it's gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous colour. And I bought this from Maker Maker, which is the local yarn store in Melbourne. Got some lovely wool. And then I've also got this cake of yarn that I spun from, I bought the braid from Kathy's Fibres, and I've got a swatch. And this is merino silk. Just made this. I've got this, you would have seen this last week. This is a roll lag of a semi-scoured Corriedale fleece from Cloverleaf Corriedale. And then I've got some washed locks, also from Cloverleaf Corriedale, that I've washed, but that's it. That's all that's sort of happened to those. Now, this skein I'm going to use to demonstrate these 6 main kinds of touch that I was reading about. And then I'll just sort of show how they don't all apply, or they apply differently to different forms that wool takes, right? And the different ways that might compel us to touch it. So there's this idea of lateral motion. So it's like a stroking kind of thing. And this we do mostly to determine texture. So softness, roughness, particularly. Smoothness. Something could be soft and not smooth, I think. Anyway, there's that. And then there's unsupported holding. So, and we do this to determine weight. It's about 100 grams. I don't think I could really determine that if I didn't know it. When things are heavier, I find it easier to determine weight, but when they get lighter and lighter, I find that a bit harder. Maybe that's true for everyone. Maybe I'll just get better at that as I go. There's also pressure, so pushing on something as another form of touch to determine hardness. So how soft or hard is the thing. And then enclosure is another form of touch. So the grabbing or gripping of something and trying to enclose it. Could do it with 2 hands. Right, we do this to determine volume. But a lot of, I'd say this is also kind of pressure as well, right? Especially with wool, right? We call it squishing. Wool lovers go, I like to squish the wool. And it gives us hardness, but also volume in terms of information. And then static contact, just touching something still. We often do this to determine temperature of something. And then contour following is the last one, where we will trace the shape and the contours of something to try to learn something about it. So these are the 6 main kinds of touch that I was reading about in one particular article. Now, if I grab these washed locks, it's really a different kettle of fish in some ways about how I'm going to touch them. And one thing is that I can't rub this backwards and forwards without holding on to it with some, I can't, if I put it here and try to do it, once I put enough pressure to actually feel anything, then the whole thing just moves. It doesn't have enough of its own weight. So it requires more kind of gripping with another hand, or, I could put it between my knees. But actually it's more of a stroking than a backwards and forwards that kind of, the locks kind of say, well, if you want to get a sense of my texture, you're going to have to do it like that. You can't do it like that quite so easily. The unsupported holding, with this amount, I can't even feel it except for the way it's a slightly different temperature. Over time especially, I can feel it, it's a bit insulative, right? So, but I can't determine weight because it's just too light. Even with that much, I can barely feel any weight to it. So you've got to have a lot more. The pressure, the hardness, so like if I squish it like this, it's pretty flexible because it's kind of like a soft solid. So it does tell me something about, I can feel a certain kind of tension or elasticity by doing that. Again, enclosure, if I'm holding enough of it, it's okay. If I just get this little bit, I don't know, it's like I almost can't squish it small enough. It tells me something, but maybe not as much as this kind of feels because it's got a solidness to it, right? What if you've got static contact? If I was just holding it to determine warmth. That works. That one works. Contour following. Sure, you could try it. I mean, the contour moves a lot. One thing I notice about locks that have got a lot of crimp is that I really want to be able to see, can I feel the crimp? Because it just looks really delightful. As something to feel. So there's something that, it's not just knowledge generation. We're not just touching something to learn about it. We're also touching something to have an experience that we hope will be enjoyable. Now, of course, another thing with locks is we'll use haptic perception or haptics, particularly movement, and we'll couple it with auditory to determine how strong is the lock. So you get it and you pull it tight near your ear. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it. probably just hear my watch jiggling. Anyway, this one sounds really good. It's supposed to just sound like the same twang over and over again, and there shouldn't be any kind of crunching or tearing sound. But that's a way in which we're coupling senses to get to know something. So that's knowledge generation through haptic and auditory perception. That's really, and we could couple it with visual, right? If we had our glasses on. You could also look for bends or wonky bits or breaking bits too. But that snapping test is really important. So that's a form of knowledge generation through haptic perception coupled with auditory. I think that's very cool. But then if I start looking at some of these other forms that wool is taken, right? Like a cake, a yarn cake. It's the same amount of wool as this. It's about 100 grams. I think it's not just me, but when you get a yarn cake, how do you want to touch it? Like, I really want to squish it, so I want to apply pressure and that kind of enclosure. I also want to squish it this way, like I want to check how dense it is. I don't want to wreck it, but I can't help myself. I want to kind of get a sense of the solidness of the cake. There's something really enjoyable about that. I don't know that it tells me much, probably tells me that it's a reasonably well spun cake. It's maybe not going to be a total mess as I get closer to the centre. We'll see. So yeah, interesting. I don't tend to want to stroke it, like use lateral touch on it. Again, it's too light I can feel it, but I don't get a lot of information. It's light, of course. This one, there's not many things I want to do with it. I want to smell it. I like smelling these, but I'm only going to want to pull it when it comes to pre-drafting, and then I will use some kind of lateral tension to do that. But I generally, because it's in this like liminal, but it's an in-between state. This I feel like I can scrunch around a bit, but this I'm going to be more delicate with because it's a roll ag ready to spin and I don't want to mess it up. So I'll be kind of, the way in which I'll want to touch it is a bit more gentle, I guess. And some stroking is kind of okay. Again, like weight or pressure, it's so light and hardly there that it's lovely though. And one thing with this, of course, is because there's grease still in it, there's a way in which, and this is not very greasy, so it's not much, but there's a way in which I can feel something on the surface of my skin. So again, another form of haptic knowledge generation just happened there where I could feel, this has got a little bit of that lanolin. It's not sticky, but it's something. Whereas this doesn't have anything like that. It leaves nothing on my hands. This one, it's turned into a surface now with all the knitting, right? And I can touch it, do lateral touch to determine texture. It's nice and soft. If I fold it up enough, I can do pressure, but if it's just flat, I don't find that a particularly useful. I think it's too thin. But yeah, if I fold it over a few times, pressure gives me a sense of soft or hard. And then, weight, I can do that. But you know what, when I grab one of these, and I think I'm not the only one here again, is I want to stretch it. Now, I have already done the stitch counting on this. It's a swatch for a garment, so I'm not wrecking my swatch now. But you shouldn't stretch it before you get to before you finish your counts. But now I just want to stretch it and see what does it do. And so there's a way in which I'm wanting to generate some knowledge about this by stretching it and pulling on it, which isn't in those other kinds of touch actually. So I think maybe that's a slightly different form, right, which is the kind of pulling on something to determine elasticity, and like how big can it get? What happens if I do it like that? Anyway, I think once it's into a knitted surface, it compels us to kind of touch and move with something in different ways. Now I think that's super interesting actually, because there's this one idea, especially around making things, that humans just go, I just want to make this thing, I will go make it, and I will make the material, just do what I want. And another idea which says, well, actually, whenever you're making, you are in a kind of a relationship or a correspondence with the materials, because it depends on the materials too. It's a collaboration. They won't do everything you want them to do. They're only going to do some things, not others. And we know this about different sheep breeds of wool, right? Some wools are great for this, some wools are great for that. If you try to make a sweater with all alpaca, it's going to feel nice and soft, but it's not going to look good for very long. It's going to peel like blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure. Right, so different breeds of wool even, right, direct actually what you should or shouldn't make with them, or how it's going to go if you do. And so this idea of a collaboration, I think, is really interesting. And I think it's already at this stage in the way in which wool in different forms directs different forms of touch. And different kinds of sensory engagement too, right? Because with wool, I also want to sniff it. Even when I'm in a store and I know it's so processed, there's not going to be any sheepy smell to it anymore. I still want to touch. I still want to smell it. Partly I think I'm checking for synthetic fragrances because that'll ruin my knitting experience. But there's some kind of smell. It's not nothing. Anyway, it's lovely. But that's also really interesting to me, is what other kind of senses do we want to engage in our exploration and knowledge gaining and relating with wool. That's really interesting to me, because we want to look at it, but we touch it a lot. Anyway, it does lead me to also start thinking about how we touch yarn at different stages of ownership and making, right? So when you're in the yarn store, you imagine yourself, you walk in, probably excited, you pick up your first skein of yarn or ball or something. How do you touch it? What do you do with it? Do you smell it surreptitiously if you think that the store owner's not looking? Do you like touch it on? I usually touch it on my neck just to check how itchy is it going to be on my wrists. But then when you get it home and you own it and now it's in your stash, do you touch it differently? And then when it's in the stash versus when it's being made it's a work in progress. Like, do you handle yarn differently between stash and whip? And then what's the difference between how you handle yarn when it's work in progress and then when it's a finished object? And then also when it's a finished object, it's a new finished object or an old finished object. Like, how do you handle the fabric, right? It's still yarn, still wool. How do you handle that wool differently? And so I just think they're really interesting questions that point to the different ways we're relating and different meanings we're ascribing, but also the different ways the yarn is directing us to interact with it based on the kind of phase that it is in its journey from like sheep to garment or some kind of made object, right? Anyway, so if you have any thoughts of that about, or if you've noticed how you touch yarn differently along that journey, put them in the comments, because I'm super interested in this. It's actually not part of my research topic at all. I'm just really interested. And I do watch people in yarn stores, I have to say, and I watch myself. But yeah, if you ever see me in a yarn store and I'm looking at you, I'm probably looking at how you're touching yarn. Okay, so that's what I think. Oh, one last thing. If you're a spinning fleece too, right? Same thing, but a bit different. Noticing how you touch the fleece from when it's like raw wool, how you touch it as you're scouring it, if you scour it, then how, and all the things you do before scouring, all the things you do after scouring, before spinning, the plying, then, you know, putting into all the things along that path, right? Like, how do you touch and interact sensorially with wool in different ways across that journey? And just sort of thinking, it's not just functional, right? It's like we do it because it's also enjoyable. I'm just noticing, right, with this, I don't need to do this particularly to process this fleece, but the pulling the locks apart, it's very satisfying. And I suspect I'm learning something. This is the challenge I was talking about before, right, around doing something and being aware of what you're doing at the same time. It's a challenge. It's fun. Okay, what am I making this week? Not a lot, because I've been reading a lot and playing with wool a lot. But I am still working on, nearly finished, and I will be finished maybe tonight, still working on this beautiful Julie's Shorties by Matushka Makes. I'm just onto the last little bit of the toe box there, and that's the second sock, and then I'm going to block them and give them to my daughter. And then so I don't have a lot of spare time these days, not complaining, but I don't have a lot of spare time. So I did something potentially a little ill-advised, of course. I signed up for a test knit. Now I do love test knits because I like deadlines and it just kind of gets me really moving on a project. So I'm testing, I don't know if it'll come up, but you can see it on Instagram somewhere. So this is Minimi Knit Design, and this is the Pyramid Cloud Cardigan, and it's like a little short sleeve cardigan, buttons down the front, but you can switch the whole thing around. You can have the buttons at the back too. It's a really cute construction as well, and it's in DK weight yarn, so it's knitting up pretty quick. And what am I making it with? That's very exciting. So I'm using this Kier's Garn. It's a merino silk blend. I got this at Yarn Over Berlin several years ago. I don't think they stock it anymore. But this is Grimmy, the colourway. It's really, really lovely. I've made a beanie with some of this before. I've also got, because I'm combining 3 yarns, holding them together to make the DK weight, this is a merino silk lace weight yarn from Cola Girl, which is a dyer, who is a dyer in Adelaide. I got this at Bendigo a couple of years ago. Just kind of been sitting in the stash, me thinking, what did I buy 2-ply for? I didn't know what I was doing. But actually, I'm really getting into holding multiple yarns at once. It kind of creates different colours, but the depth and the kind of changingness of, anyway, it's loving it. But this is like the crowning glory. This is a cone from Itoman and Co. So I got it at an op shop, and if you're speaking American English, it's a thrift store. I don't know how many, it was a couple of dollars or something. And I reckon if I use my unsupported haptic perception weight thing, I reckon it's like half a kilo. Mohair silk. Pretty sure that's what it is. Anyway, that's the other thing I'm knitting this with, and that's quite lovely. I like putting mohair in things for the texture. So that's the main thing I've kind of gotten to work on this week, and I've got to the 22nd, but I only have to get kind of down to the armpits for that to be useful for the designer, but I reckon I'll get it done. But no progress on anything else, no sewing, no spinning, but I am not complaining because I am still living my dream life of getting to research and read all about wool all the time. So yeah, that's been my week. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a lovely weekend where you get to make and touch things that are lovely, whether they're soft or rough or maybe something else. And yeah, I see you next week. Okay, bye.